Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for tuning in, and hope everybody had a good Chag. We're finished, moving on to the winter. Mashiv Haruach Amor Gashem, and hope everybody has successfully passed the test through Yom Kippur, Aseret Yemei Tshuva, Hoshana Rabbah. So you're here, that's a good sign. Tonight, depending on where you're tuning in from, we're going to dedicate this shiur to our beloved son, Ari Yoshua Halevi, Hashem Yikom Damo. The yortzeit was yesterday, and in fact, his birthday is coming up in just 2 days. So these two events kind of run together. And so we thought we'd have a special shiur, even though this is our usual time, and dedicate it to him. Just a word of mention about our schedule. We will not meet again until 3 weeks from tonight. So we'll have 2 Thursdays where we will not be meeting. So if you click on, you might be staring at an empty Zoom room. So don't blame me. I'll announce that at the end if I remember as well. So we're going to talk about today, this issue of sibling rivalry as reflected in this amazing story of Kayin and Hevel, of which we don't know too much about. We have to depend almost completely on the midrashim, because the Torah doesn't tell us too much. We do know a few things. First of all, we know that Kayin and Hevel had different occupations, that, and the Torah tells us that Kayin, he worked the land. Hevel, he worked the fields, the land, and Hevel was a shepherd. Perhaps you could also say he was a cattleman. He had worked with all kinds of animals. And these are the two sons of Adam and Chava. And as a matter of fact, without going too deeply into this, but Kayin was born, according to the Medrash, prior to the sin of Adam and Chava. True, that was really on their first day of creation. Nevertheless, they had this child, and there are all kinds of midrashim about whether he was born as a baby, as a full-grown person, without getting into that. Hevel, however, was born after the sin of the Eitz Hadat. In any case, I think we're all familiar with the story that we're told, Vayhi miketz yamim, it was at the end of days. Now, again, this is a very oblique phrase. We don't know how long it is, and that's why I say we're not sure exactly how old they were. Vayave Kayin mipri adama mincha l'Hashem, and Kayin has the idea of bringing a korban, some kind of an offering. A mincha doesn't here have to necessarily mean flour or a non-animal karban, but a mincha, a present. And Hevel, hevi gamhu bimchorot sono, he brings an offering as well. He brings from the animals. And vayisha Hashem el Hevel v'minchato, and God takes to, or he accepts, literally he turns to the offering not of Kayin but Hevel. Vel Kayin vel minchato lo sha'a, he doesn't turn, or he doesn't favor it. And then we know what happens. Vayichar lekayin ma'od vayiplu panav, he gets very, very upset and angry. Hashem at that point intercedes and says, why are you so angry? You know, sin is always there as an option. It's waiting at the door, and you can overcome it. Vatatim shalbo. And then we have this key pasuk, which is very oblique. Vayomer Kayin el Hevel achiv, and Kayin said to Hevel, his brother. And then we have a blank space. We don't know what happens. We'll come back to that. Vayhi biotam basadeh, they were in the field. Vayakum Kayin el Hevel achiv vayargeu, and Kayin comes up upon his brother and he kills him. And then the famous statement that we're all familiar with, that when Hashem says, "Ei Hevel achicha," where is Hevel, your brother? Kayin says, "Lo yadati," I don't know. Hashomer achi anochi. And we'll talk about what that means, which is usually or often mistranslated. And then, of course, Hashem is angry. He says, the bloods of not the blood, but the bloods of your brother are screaming out to me. So Akimelai, because there will never be any descendants from Hevel. He'll be eliminated without any lineage to speak of. And then Kayin is given his punishment without going deeply into that. So we see right from the very beginning of history, we see problems. Most of our problems are all in the family. As the show indicated, famous show that we all grew up on. Intra-family hatred, jealousy, war. This is endemic to the Jewish people. It's basically all in the family. We see this between Yitzchak and Yishmael. They're half brothers. We see between Yaakov and Esav, they're twin brothers. Yosef and his brothers, also half brothers. And then we have all the other permutations. Amalek is also a family member from Esav. Ammon and Moab, also family members, of course, from Lot. And the whole Arab-Jewish conflict, these are cousins, as we say. They're all in the family. Most of the difficulties we have in history are coming within the family. And this is the single greatest challenge, it seems, of the Jewish people. First, solve the problems within our own family. And I don't want to belabor the point as we approach elections, but we know the conflict that can exist, the very bitter and difficult and divisive conflict between brothers. What about this fight? What was going on here between Kayin and Hevel? The Torah doesn't tell us. Was it simply a case of jealousy? I think that's on the surface. After all, Kayin brings an offering, it's not accepted. Hevel, his brother, brings an offering, it is accepted. So clearly there is a certain amount of jealousy. However, the Perushim, Chazal, they have a lot of different ideas about what this fight was about. Someone to say that fight was economic, that Kayin and Hevel decided, we're the only offspring that are on this world. So let's split the world between us. And one says, I'll take all of the metaltalim, all of the movable objects, all that will belong to me. And the other one says, okay, in that case, I'll take the real estate. I'll take all the land, and that will belong to me. And then they begin, it's not enough for them. They begin to fight. So the one who takes the land says to the other, I want you off my land. Well, how can that be? Well, how am I supposed to get off your land? So he says, uf mikan, an expression that we've apparently picked up in Israel. Fly out of here. Fly, get off my land. And the other one says, okay, well, take off your clothes because all the clothes belong to me. These are movable, these are objects, and they come from animals, and I own all the animals as well. So take off your clothes. So they're in this dispute and can't get along and learn to share between them. And so they have this economic fight. Others want to say, no, maybe the fight was religious, that they agreed to split the land. However, they couldn't decide. They had this vision that there would someday be built a Beit HaMikdash, and each one wanted it in their land, whatever the split was. And they fought about that until they came to blows and death. Some want to say that the fight was over theology, which is often, as we see often in the world today, the fight about theology can be deadly, and people take it so seriously that they kill others because of it. And Kayin and Hevel are having this whole debate about God, about the essence of God and his connection to humanity, that Kayin says that God is not just. God shows favoritism. He's not a fair and honest God. And then Hevel says, no, definitely not true. God isn't favoring me because of some agenda that he has or ulterior motive. He's favoring me because I brought the better offering. And then they have a debate, is there reward or punishment in this world? And Kayin says, no, there isn't. Hevel says, that's not true. There's skar va'onesh, the good are rewarded, the bad are punished. And they have all these arguments, these very deep theological arguments that we're still fighting over today. And they're perhaps ignoring the fact that Kayin is bringing an offering that was less than perfect or less than exemplary. He had control over any of the produce of the field, but he brought something that was somewhat inferior. According to some, it was flax, which is a very basic product of the field. He could have brought something much, much nicer. And Hevel brought a sheep, which is something, it wasn't probably the best. Someone to say, if you like a good steak, he could have brought cattle, but sheep at least was something of much greater value. And that seems to be a major part of this argument, which we'll come back to that in a moment. Another explanation is that, and you might have guessed this, that they were actually fighting about a woman, which we know can lead to a lot of arguments. According to the Medrash, both Kayin and Hevel were born with twin sisters who they married, right? Even though this is the classic case of Gilu Arayot, of immorality and incest, but nevertheless, if you're going to populate the world, there isn't any real choice. In this case, you're going to have to marry your sister. There are no other women available. And that's why one of the explanations of this phrase, Olam Chesed Yibaneh, that God made a world through with kindness. He extended sometimes a exemption to the law, and in order to have the world be populated, there had to be an exception to the rule of incest, and that's how they were able to ultimately populate the world. However, Hevel was born with two sisters, because in the pasuk it uses the word et, and it's written once at the birth of Kayin, but it's said twice at the birth of Hevel. Without going too deep, you can see that in the text. Vateled et Kayin, vatosef laledet et achiv et Hevel. So there it says et twice, and they learn from there, since it says that word twice, and it's a kind of a feminine word, et, that it refers to the fact that Hevel was born with two sisters. And that's who they fought over. Who would get to marry the extra wife? Kayin said, he's the oldest, so it's my right. I can marry this second wife. And Hevel says, no, she was born with me, therefore it's my right. So according to some, that was what they argued about. Well, we see, so we're not 100% sure exactly what they were arguing about. Rashi tells us that, and we're trying to fill in the blanks, this very oblique pasuk, Vayomer Hashem el Kayin et nachta, stop. Hashem said to Kayin, and then it follows what he actually told him. But when it comes Vayomer Kayin el Hevel achiv, nothing follows. We don't know what Kayin said to Hevel. Rashi says, Rashi understands this is a problem, and he says, Nichnas imo b'divrei riv, that he kind of baited him into a fight, and once the quarrel started, it ended in this very tragic way with Kayin killing Hevel. But some want to say that there's something else going on here. Again, we don't know. Sometimes when you see something missing, that's a clue and indicative almost as much as when something is mentioned. So it must perhaps have been, we're just assuming that Kayin was in a very distraught state. He had had his offering rejected by Hashem, and perhaps he was looking for support. He wants to at least get some kind of comfort and some kind of camaraderie from his only brother. And so he comes and he speaks to him, but Hevel never answers him. And he gets nothing at all. And it's interesting that we use in a couple of different places, Vayomer Kayin el Hevel achiv, Vayakum Kayin el Hevel achiv. Twice the same pasuk talks about the fact that Kayin calls us his brother. He's my brother. I'm hurting. God has rejected me or rejected my offering. I need a shoulder to cry on. And he doesn't get that from Hevel. So maybe that's what pushed him over the edge. And certainly, of course, the silence of Hevel does not justify this crime. The greatest murder in history is wiping out 25, or you can say 20% of the world's population. So nothing justifies that, but we can see how devastating silence sometimes can be and how therapeutic the right words at the right time can also help. And there are times, as we say, when talk is cheap and silence is golden, but there's time when it's just the opposite, that we have to recognize sometimes silence can be destructive and not constructive. Trying to understand a little bit the deeper idea of what's going on here between these brothers. Kayin is, and we always look at the name of something when we want to understand what is the deeper idea here. Kayin, and we see when the names are given, Vatomer Chava names Kayin, Kaniti ish et Hashem, basically meaning I have acquired someone with Hashem. It's almost, Chava is saying, I'm a partner with God. And when we make a kinyan, we're binding someone to something. We know about this at a wedding, where we're, of course, binding a chatan and a kala. We know this in business transactions. So the word kayin connects to kinyan. And that means kayin is something of real substance. However, Hevel, we don't know anything about that name. Chava doesn't name him, but Tosef Laledet Tachivet Hevel, that's missing. We don't see them talking about it, but we know the word Hevel is not a very positive name. Hevel means basically nothingness, air, vapor. It can also mean vanity, as we see, if we read about it so much in Kohelet, Hevel Havalim, the vanity of vanities. It's a very negative kind of name. And therefore, we can suggest that Kayin was a person of substance. He thought about bringing the carbon. It wasn't Hevel. Hevel copied him. The problem is, although he definitely was a person of substance, Kayin, nevertheless, and by the way, as we know, all of humanity will be descended from Kayin. No one will be descended from Hevel. So Kayin really, in a sense, he is the father of humanity, joining together with Naamah, the wife of Noach. The two of them really are the mother and father of all humanity. But Kayin let this empowerment, let this higher level of being go to his head, what we'd call maybe extreme empowerment, where he thought in a sense that he has kind of godlike powers, that he is almost on an equal with God. And therefore, someone to suggest he wanted to show, well, if I'm like God, I have power over life and death. This, by the way, is we mentioned before this phrase, Hashomer Achi Anochi, where he says to God, am I my brother's keeper? Someone to say this is not a question, it's a statement. When God says to him, look what you did to your brother. So he says, wait a minute, why are you blaming me? Hashomer achi anochi. Anochi is the name of God, like we see in the Ten Commandments. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Anochi is God. So Kayin is saying, why are you blaming me? My brother's keeper is you, Anochi, you, God. You created the world. You're in charge of life and death. If Hevel is dead, you probably wanted it that way because you control everything. We, of course, know that this isn't the way it works. People have free will. But in a sense, Kayin is challenging God with a very powerful theological question. And he's saying to him, at the end of the day, everything that happens in the universe comes from you. So why am I being blamed? And he's not factoring in this idea of bechira chavshit. In any case, one more item to mention in all of these ideas about what was the fight about. And it seems again that it all kind of draws back to the fact that Kayin thought very highly of himself. And when he was turned down, that's a very difficult pill to swallow. And even though he was, in a sense, of greater substance or of greater stature than Hevel, nevertheless, it didn't allow for him to do what he did and then to try to shift the blame to God. And it's true that he thought of the Karban, Hevel copied it, but nevertheless, Hevel gave something that giving more of himself than anybody else. Now, I want to mention something that the prominent in the Chabad theology, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who's the Alter Rebbe, said, he says as follows: the source of Kain's neshama was incredibly high, much higher than Hevel. He agrees on that. And he did not see the world as having any value. In his worldview, there was godliness, and he considered himself really a kind of demigod, and nothing else. The world was meaningless. So it followed there was no such thing as good or bad produce. He could bring whatever he wanted to as an offering. But says the Alter Rebbe that this was the mistake that Kayin made. God created the world for a reason, so that we will elevate it. And he wants us to relate to it as having a very real purpose, that we live in this world, we have to perfect this world, and we should not be looking for a way to escape the world and to say, I've moved beyond the world as it exists and physicality. No, that's not what Hashem wants. We have to work like the field. We have to work the field and work the earth and work the world and utilize it to serve Hashem and to emulate the midot and the virtues of Hashem. And that was what Kayin's real mistake was. He was kind of living halfway between heaven and earth, and he should have been concentrating on doing his share to perfect the world. So I want to say that in all of these different aspects of this fight between Kayin and Hevel, we'll never know for sure the real reasons of what happened here, because the Torah is leaving it open to our exploration. And maybe all of these ideas of what that fight was about, all of them have a certain merit, but all of them need to have a certain tikun. And I want to suggest in dedicating the shiur to Ari, and I think the life he lived and what he was able to do in his relatively short life, which was just short of 22 years, that he was able to provide a certain kind of tikkun. First of all, he was a person of very great substance. He was very bright, very personable, and obviously he was able to join an elite fighting unit, a Sayeret Nachal, which very difficult to get into. But he was also at the same time very, very humble. And he didn't brag about any of his accomplishments. He didn't take that and say, I must be some kind of a great person, like Kayin thinks, well, I'm the most important person in the world. He never felt that way. And even the things he did, which were, I think, significant accomplishments, he would never brag about it. He was in a dangerous mission once, and some of you may know the magazine he was wearing, which held that machsanit that holds the extra bullets. So he was in this firefight, and afterwards he realized, he saw that there was a bullet had hit this machsanit that he wore on his hip, essentially, in case he needed more, and it bounced off because the machsanit is made of very hard metal. Had it hit anywhere else, it could have been fatal. This was maybe a year before Ari fell in battle. And when he told us, he rarely told us about the missions he was in. He was in during a month after he joined the army, began the Second Intifada. He was constantly in dangerous missions. He never talked about it. In this case, he came home and he said to me, Abba, I have to bench Gomel because my life really was saved. But he said, I don't want to go to our usual shul. He said, I want to go somewhere where people don't know me. Because if I come to my shul and I bench Gomel, everybody's going to want to ask, what happened to you? And I don't want to be a schwitzer, as they say, and start telling people I was in such a dangerous mission. And I'd rather go somewhere where people don't know me. In terms of getting along with one's brother or one's fellow human being, Ari also always sacrificed for others. One of the things he did that, as yesterday at the Askara, we were speaking to the mayor, ex-mayor of Renana, who's friends with our family, Mayor Zevik, we call him, Bielski. He said that one of the things that Ari did is something you almost never find a soldier doing, and that is when he has a free Shabbat and can go home, sometimes Ari would give that to another soldier and say, you go home, I'll stay on base. And we, of course, were not wild about that because we didn't see him very often. But if he felt somebody else needed that more, he would give away that Shabbat. And that's a tremendous sacrifice in the army. He never ignored his fellow soldiers. He had an issue with sleeping. We even took him to be tested for sleep apnea, that he couldn't fall asleep. But what happened as a result of that was when he couldn't sleep late at night, he would keep the fellow soldiers who were on guard duty late at night. He would go out and speak to them. It's a very lonely thing to be on guard duty, especially at 3 in.the morning, 4 in.the morning. He couldn't sleep anyway. He went to talk to them. And many of the soldiers said that they got to be friendly with him when they would have these conversations late at night, when they normally would be alone, and it would help to keep them awake. And it was something that, he felt, if I can't sleep anyway, let me go and speak to a fellow soldier. I think most of all, as we said in this last idea about wanting to perfect the world, which is what Rav Shlomo Zalman had said, that this is really our purpose is not to become an angel. Well, there's time to do that when we go to Olam Haba, but when we're mortal people, we have to make the world better. And Ari wanted to do something valuable and important with his life. And he chose that. He chose to do something hard when he could have taken the easy way out. He signed up for a combat role. He took us off and to get into this elite Sayeret Palchan HaNachal unit. He didn't have to do that, but he wanted to do that. And he never quit, even when he had the chance to step in the background. I've told the story about him that very quickly, that after 2 years in the army, he could have, if he wanted to, he could have stepped back and let the new recruits coming into the unit take the more dangerous missions. And he asked us what we thought he should do. He was an explosives expert. He was the sharpshooter of the unit. And he said, should I step back and let others take over? And I'll just go on the more simpler missions, or maybe I won't go as often on the dangerous missions. And we said to him, speak to your mefaked, speak to your commanding officer about that. We can't tell you what to do. We don't know enough about the army. And after he was killed, I spoke to his mefaked. He came to the Shiva, and I said to him, what did you say to Ari when he asked you about stepping back and letting some of the younger recruits take over? What did you tell him? And the mefaked said, he never asked me. He never once mentioned it to me. And I guess Ari decided, I'm trained to do all these things, and I'm not going to stop doing it as long as I can contribute. Then why should I let others take my place? So I think that Ari really is a kind of dugma ishit, a kind of personal role model. When we talk about sibling rivalry and jealousy and brutal competition between brothers, I think Ari's life was a kind of tikkun, a kind of kapara for all these Kayins and Hevels in history that they can't get along. Enough is never enough for them, no matter what they have, that they find a reason to fight over everything. Ari was really a peacemaker, even in the family. Ari was always the peacemaker, trying to keep any of the kids from fighting with one another. And I think that's those are some of the things which really remain with us, even in a relatively short life. It's hard for us to judge what's short, what's long, but I think he accomplished a great deal in his life. So here we are on the eve of another election. It's certainly not a perfect scenario for brotherly love. There's a lot of rivalry going on, but I think we have to try, in my humble opinion, we have to try to choose those people that are not defaming and degrading the others, but always trying to look for a way of unifying people. And we don't have enough of that. And if nobody running in the election, in my opinion, represents that viewpoint, then we may have to wait for another election or two or three. It's not always a case of choosing the lesser of the evils. Sometimes, if you wait long enough, maybe people get the idea that I have to have a better way. So I want to thank everybody for joining in, and hope that you will have only Besorot Tovot. And we thank all the people. We were very fortunate that at the Askara, the Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, spoke beautifully about Ari yesterday. And I think that his theme, and I think the proper theme and the message is that we have to give selflessly of ourselves, and as our soldiers do, and in general, we have to promote not sibling rivalry, but sibling brotherhood. And we do have differences between us. That's how Hashem created us, but it doesn't mean that we can't find common ground. And whatever we do, we should do out of love. So thank you for all joining in. And we will be back again in 3 weeks. Thanks to our intrepid host, Yassi, for always doing a good job and reminding me that Mincha's coming and it's time to stop. So we'll see you again, I hope, in 3 weeks. We're going to talk about Lot, or we'll have a lot to say about the issue of Moshiach and the strange roots of where Moshiach comes from. So to everybody, Besorot Tovot, Shabbat Shalom, have a good winter, and thank you all for coming, and see you next time.